Hi, and welcome to our dam removal webinar series from American Rivers. Today, we're really excited that everyone's joining us here for our webinar on barrier removal as a climate resilient strategy. We have three incredible speakers joining us today. We have Dr. Sarah Null from Utah State University. We have Erin Singer-McCombs from American Rivers, and we have Megan Quinn also from American Rivers. And I'm so excited for the information that these folks will share with you today. Few housekeeping notes before we dive in. You all are muted and your cameras are off, but you can communicate with us using the chat and Q&A features. If you navigate down to the bottom of your screen, you should find them there. Please use chat for comments and Q&A for questions. It's really hard when questions get lost in the chat. Please take a moment now to enter your name, organization, and location into the chat so we can see who's here. I also want to pause and acknowledge that we are very busy in our lives right now, and it's easy to try to multitask. And I'd like to invite everybody to be present with us today as we move through this really important information on how barrier removal is a climate resiliency tool. And all the research that's gone into this, Dr. Sarah Null is going to walk us through the research into her paper on enhancing climate resiliency through dam barrier removal. Megan Quinn is going to lead us through the work on the ground in California and how climate change has impacted the operation of dams there. And Erin is going to help us learn about the impacts of climate change on dams in the Southeast and all the excellent work she's been doing there to advocate for policy reform and a different approach to preparing for these large storms. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Null. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Hi there, everyone. It's good to be in this webinar today, and I'm going to start us out by talking about enhancing climate resilience through dam and barrier removal. Okay, in the United States, we have over 550,000 dams and barriers built, since the late 1700s. And on this figure here, I'm showing time on the x-axis and then dam height on the y-axis. And all these gray dots are dams that were built. However, sometimes yesterday's solutions create today's problems. And so you can see the blue dots, and those are the over 2,000 dams that have been removed in the US. About 84% have been removed since 2000. And so this is an increasing trend here in the US. And then on top of that, we have climate pressures that are impacting river systems and the infrastructure that we've built, like dams and barriers. So namely, we have warming temperatures. And with warming temperatures, we have increasingly drier conditions. We have shrinking snowpack as precipitation shifts from snowfall to rainfall. That generally creates shorter, intense wet seasons and these drier, more prolonged dry seasons. And so our conditions are fundamentally changing. We're getting more storms that are increasingly volatile. So we're getting these extreme storms that we can have very dry periods and then these really, really wet systems pass through. In coastal areas, we have rising sea level, of course, and then we're also having more severe wildfires. And that impacts reservoirs because we get more sedimentation with wildfires. We get things like flame retardants flowing into reservoirs. So fires also really impact our water infrastructure. So for this study, I'm really focusing on unsafe, obsolete, and outdated dams. So for example, we know that aging dams and extreme weather events can coincide, and those can increase the risk of dam failure, or we can have some near misses. So you can see this news release from 2022 there on the right. And then things like underperforming or obsolete structures that no longer fulfill their intended purpose. So sometimes they're relics from earlier water management. These can be things like hydropower dams, which are due to maybe prolonged droughts are not meeting their benefits. They're not generating the hydropower that we thought they would. Sometimes old structures that have been abandoned. And along with this idea, removing dams can often cost less than retrofitting dams. So we know that we still want to keep some dams on our landscape. And as our infrastructure ages, we want to prioritize funding to those dams that we do want to keep. Okay, so I did a literature review to answer the question, how does dam and barrier removal influence climate resilience? So I looked at a scientific database, Scopus, and then it also happens that a lot of dam removal reports don't make it to peer review. So I also looked at Google Scholar. I had some search terms here you can see, so things about dam removal or barrier removal or dam decommissioning. And then they also needed to have some climate resilience term, like climate change, climate resilience, adaptation. So from those studies, I did a quick review. I wanted to make sure that they were on topic. I wanted to make sure they specifically linked dam and barrier removal to how it impacts or how it changes climate resilience. I used snowball sampling, so that means that I looked at the reference list, and if I came across new studies in that reference list, I added them right in. Okay, so one big finding that became clear, really apparent very quickly, is that as scientists, we've done a very good job at describing how dams impact people in the environment, and there's a really broad and deep literature on this topic. Sometimes and increasingly where we have nice literature showing, nice science studies showing how removing dams restores rivers. And then increasingly there's some literature on how river restoration boosts climate resilience, but there's not a whole lot of studies directly linking dam and barrier removal to climate resilience. However, I did find 50. So this is an international search. This is international literature, even though about 2/3 of it was focused on North America. So here you can see the number of studies through time. The first one was just in 2009. So this is quickly increasing body of literature, and then the publications per year and the cumulative that came to 50 pubs. And this was through September of 2024. All right, so what did we find with this? How is dam and barrier removal changing or influencing climate resilience? And so I coded these studies based on some categories. So I put reconnecting rivers as its own category, and then I categorized biological benefits or impacts, water quality, physical or chemical changes, and social changes. And so a couple of the really big highlights that I wanna bring out for you guys is reconnecting rivers is generally beneficial for resilient landscapes with climate warming. And you can see this really kind of huge bar here. And one thing to notice is that some studies could have multiple benefits. For example, there could be a study that said reconnecting rivers um, provides access to cooler stream temperatures and benefits fisheries, for example. So we might have coded more than one category here. Temperature came up, water temperature and access to cool water came up repeatedly as a benefit. Changing flow regimes came up repeatedly, especially thinking of the associated fluxes, like for example, sediment transport. And then removing unsafe dams to create safe and resilient communities was one of the biggest topics that came up. So you can see this, these yellow bars, so safety, lost utility was another big one. And this is interesting because a lot of our previous literature on dam impacts and some dam removal studies have focused primarily on ecosystems and the environment. And this climate resilience, dam removal, or barrier removal literature is really different, that the safety aspects come up again and again. And then with that, there's some cultural aspects too. So for example, restoring traditional customs and foods for tribes was a repeated topic that we would see highlighted over and over. And then I was really interested in how do we measure climate resilience? Because it's a little bit esoteric, right? How exactly do we measure that? So overall, we've discovered about 70 unique metrics of climate resilience with dam and barrier removal studies. And I'm going to walk you through just a couple here. So I wanted to look at, okay, what is the impact? What are we resilient to what? So for example, stream temperatures. For resilience for what? So in a lot of cases, it might be access to cooler stream reaches for salmon, trout. I don't have it on here. Herring was another very popular or very common objective, with the idea of maybe the nature-based solution here is reconnecting river reaches. And then so some of the metrics, some are really straightforward, like days exceeding temperatures that are unsuitable for certain organisms or species. Connecting river lengths, again, a really easy one. And then I'm going to look now jumping to the bottom. So another one is being resilient to extreme precipitation and flooding and removing unsafe infrastructure from our landscape. That's for human health and safety. And so a nature-based solution is providing space for flood and again, removing that dangerous infrastructure. And so some of the metrics used here are looking at the return period of the historical 100-year flood. So often dams in the past were built to withstand a 100-year flood. However, with changing precipitation patterns and these really extreme events, we're tending to get this 100-year period more frequently right now. So it might be every 40 or 60 years, we get what was the traditional 100-year flood. Another way of evaluating this is just looking at average annual stream flow or looking at the probable maximum flood. And so those are things that we could put into our, say, design specifications for future dams or for future retrofits. And then another really interesting result we found is that practitioners already are looking at climate resilience as a reason to remove dams, whether it's modeling studies about what will happen when you take dams out, or that dams that have been removed. But climate resilience, sometimes with specific benefits like bringing sediment down to coastal areas to combat sea level rise. So those are things that are already happening by practitioners. And then I want to bring your attention to this bottom bullet. So replacing pipe culverts and bridges with culverts that are adequately sized for flood flows, for increasing the more extreme storms. That's really common, and often individual states will put out guides of how to do this, and they have names with things like replacing culverts for climate resilience. So this is a really widespread change that we're finding. And then, of course, there's some reasons that dams and barriers themselves provide climate resilience. So again, we want to keep some dams and barriers on the landscape. And this was a full review was outside the scope of the study, but here this will give you kind of the idea of the flavor of the changes we saw. So sometimes keeping dams and barriers for the novel ecosystems that they sustain, blocking non-native species, cold water releases, say from the depths of large dams that stratify. Sometimes there are toxins or heavy metals in the sediment within reservoirs, and so keeping those in place. And then again, of course, we see all the social benefits, and that's usually why we build dams. So things like hydropower generation, water supply, flood risk reduction, those are important benefits to keep from some dams and barriers that we elect to keep on the landscape. So overall, this is a nice conceptual figure showing historical conditions on the very far left of what rivers looked like before we had dams and barriers on the landscape, the conditions under which dams were developed. So most of the large dams in this country were built between about the 1930s to the 1970s. However, since then, conditions have changed. So now in this current conditions box, we see increasingly these dry conditions versus the wet conditions, the sporadic wet conditions, which sometimes we might have reservoirs that don't fill or hydropower that we're not generating as much as we thought. Flood flows, again, that can exceed dam standards or dam specifications. And so then this climate resilient futures that we're showing here on the very right, where again, we're getting these big extremes between wet and dry years. Sometimes we might remove barriers to provide access to headwater reaches, cold water up there, reconnecting floodplains that will provide some reduction to flood risk or to provide some natural capacity to withstand floods. Increasing some community benefits like salmon harvests, and then connecting stream flow kind of longitudinally and sediment fluxes to combat things like sea level rise. Okay, so the big take-home key findings that we found. First, dam removal reconnects rivers, sediment fluxes, habitats, fish and wildlife, and those all have widespread benefits for climate resilience. Two, as air temperature warms, Removing dams and barriers is an effective way to provide access to cooler water for fish and wildlife. 3, as storms become more intense, removing unsafe, aging, and obsolete dams and barriers can improve human safety. 4, dams and stream barriers have already been removed to bolster climate resilience and for more frequent and severe floods and droughts. 5, measuring resilience to volatile weather for barrier removal can be as straightforward as counting connected river miles or river area, but it can also be more specific depending on the climate resilience goals. And then 6, a climate resilient future may combine nature-based solutions like removing dams and barriers with built infrastructure to provide benefits like flood protection and water supply. And then this research is available in a white paper, so you can just Google barrier removal as a strategy for climate resilience, and you'll find it. There's a fact sheet that goes along with it. And then the peer-reviewed study is still in peer review, but we expect it to be coming out in the coming months. And then I will stop sharing. Is that right, Katie? So other folks can share.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Knoll. We appreciate your research and you sharing it with us today. All right, we're going to pass it now over to Megan Quinn, our California Dam Removal Program Director.
Thanks, Katie. It's nice to see everyone here today. Thanks for attending. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what some of Dr. Knoll's research looks like when you examine the dam landscape in California. So I like to just start with a basic understanding of what the dam landscape in California looks like. First off, California has about 5,000 bank-to-bank barriers that impact and fragment our aquatic ecosystem. These inventory dams are the broadest set of dams. They are not just the tallest dams in California that are more regulated by, for instance, the Department of Water Resources, FERC, or the federal government. That would be this 1,476 dams. Those dams are taller, more regulated, and in California, about half of those dams are considered high hazard dams, or dams whose failure would lead to a loss of life or infrastructure. And then finally, we have the smallest subset of dams, which get a lot of attention. Approximately 390 of California's dams are used to generate hydropower and perform water sales. But many of these dams in California that are used to generate hydropower in particular were constructed during the pioneer era and are really aging at a rapid rate. Many of the hydropower dams were built in the 1890s and were designed to facilitate mining operations. These are some of those obsolete dams that Dr. Knoll highlighted in her presentation. When taken into account these very old dams that can sometimes be about 140 years old, California's dams are on average about 75 years of age. However, according to the Association of State Dam Safety Officials, the average a dam should have a lifespan of about 50 years. And after that 50-year point, dams require significant investment in order to maintain their safety ratings. This is particularly important in California, again, because of those 700 high hazard dams. We really want to make sure that we're enhancing safety at those sites, even though those dams were primarily built during the major era of dam building between the 1930s and the 1980s. Very importantly, as I mentioned, because many of these dams were built to facilitate mill operations and gold mining, those dams are no longer being used for the purpose which they are intended. They're considered to be obsolete, and many of them are failing in place and are very vulnerable in those larger storms that are becoming more frequent, which Dr. Knoll also highlighted in her presentation. Now, many of these dams in California and throughout the country have reduced utility and no longer serve their purpose. These maintenance issues are frequently exacerbated by climate change and its impacts on our river ecosystems. Wildfires that rip through our landscapes oftentimes will reduce or eliminate all vegetation on hillsides. And then in the next major storm event, that sediment that's on the hillside will erode into the river system and be deposited behind the dam. That sediment deposition can frequently lead to a reduction in the storage capacity located behind that particular dam. Storage capacity is also reduced by severe drought, which is becoming more frequent, more intense, and more common in California. These droughts reduce the amount of precipitation and therefore flow that's coming into our rivers that can be stored behind our dams, therefore reducing the amount of water that might be available for sale or reducing the amount of water that's available to produce hydropower. And finally, a major issue in California due to our climate is sediment deposition behind dams. This is more associated with the age of dams, though it's exacerbated by those large-scale wildfires that are becoming more frequent. But this is a photo of a dam in the Yuba River watershed that's about 120 years old. And as you can see, these folks are standing on sediment that's been deposited behind the dam over the course of its life. So this dam has effectively zero storage capacity at this point. Importantly, the reduced ability to generate hydropower and the reduced ability to store water and sell it jeopardizes the ability of the dam operator to generate revenue. And that revenue stream is really critical at these dam sites because that revenue directly can be reinvested into the maintenance of the dam. And so let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to maintain these dams. This is a chart that's from the Association of State Dam Safety Officials 2025 report titled "The Cost of Rehabilitating Dams in the United States." And it discusses the various costs that a dam owner might incur when repairing, retrofitting, or rehabilitating an aging dam. As I mentioned earlier, according to the Association of State Dam Safety Officials, dams are relatively maintenance-free and have a lifespan about 50 years. As dams approach and exceed that age, they require significant and more investment over time in order to maintain their safe operations. If you look at this first line, you'll see that dams that are just 15 feet tall can cost about $400,000 to repair. And those repairs are that's the best case cost that you're looking at. Now, these 15-foot dams are more of those bank-to-bank structures that I mentioned at the outset, those inventoried dams. When you get to the more regulated dams and the repair costs, we're looking at just for repairs, dams that are 25 to 50 feet tall, so actually meeting the California definition of a dam and therefore being regulated by Department of Water Resources or the federal government. Those dams can cost $1.4 million to repair. When thinking about California's dam landscape, we realize that a majority of the dams that are the largest in the country, in fact, 4 out of the 10 largest dams in our nation, are located on California's rivers and have significant populations that live below them. Those dams are all over 200 feet tall, and the rehabilitation of some of those older structures can cost about $100 million per structure. Let's think about this a little bit in the context of the Klamath Dam removals. Many people are aghast at the costs of those dam removals. It costs about $400 million to remove and completely rehabilitate the watershed and make significant water investments into the tributaries restoration as well. So when you think about that, for $400 million, we're getting things like tribal justice. We're getting restored access for our fisheries to those cold water refugias. We're getting enhanced recreation opportunities for our anglers, our whitewater rafters, the communities through which these rivers flow. But also for $400 million, we could have gotten 4 repaired dams that would have required that same investment every 50 years, including some minor repairs that would have cost about $9 million at a time if there were cracks or other issues with the dams. So this is just to kind of put a finer point on that figure that oftentimes dam removal can cost significantly less than the rehabilitation of a dam. Now, you might be asking yourself, why are we talking about dam repairs? I was just talking about how we can't store water behind our dams, how drought is becoming more common in California. But I think many of us know that California is one of the locations where we're really seeing this massive fluctuation between drought and deluge. California has a very volatile environment that has major implications for our rivers. For instance, the flow rate of the Kern River with its headwaters at the base of Mount Whitney can fluctuate dramatically from year to year and can range from as low as 139,000 acre feet of flow in a drought year to 2.5 million acre feet of flow in a wet year. So I can't emphasize more how important it is in California to make sure our dams are being operated safely and are being maintained to ensure that safe operation. But shockingly, many of California's dams aren't designed to withstand the hydrology that we're currently facing, or even yesterday's hydrology. Some of you may be familiar with an article that the New York Times published in 2023. This piece just did a deep dive into the design of California dams. Generally speaking, the probable maximum flow, or the largest anticipated flow event in a particular watershed, is the gold standard for dam design and is required by agencies such as FERC for the building of large hydropower dams. However, some of the outlier flows in California are very inconvenient to design for. Particularly in the 1860s, there was massive flooding throughout the state of California that was thought to be such an outlier that it should not be included in that probable maximum flood design criteria. And so what that means is that many of our dams in California are not designed to absorb what we know can be the largest flooding events in California. Taking into account the severe flooding that's anticipated due to climate impacts, significant estimate investments in our infrastructure may be necessary in California to keep our public safe. But there's good news. In California, there's been a few different policies that have been implemented over the past couple of years, including some dam safety funding that's available for the rehabilitation and retrofit of some of our dams. As Dr. Knoll highlighted, this is not about the removal of all dams. This is about the removal of those dams that are underperforming and unsafe. And there are examples all over California. You have the Potter Valley dams located on the Eel River that have major seismic issues that they are facing, as well as their impacts to fisheries and tribes in the area. And organizations are fighting hard to get those dams removed right now. You have a similar situation at Rush Creek in the eastern Sierra Nevada, where there are seismic issues with those dams, and those dams are unable to face major flooding events. There were issues with the operation of those dams in 2023 when California had what's considered to be a 200% winter in terms of precipitation in the Sierras. And then you have projects like DeSable Centerville, a hydroelectric operation that's located on Butte Creek, one of our only remaining streams that has a native salmon population that's healthy. And the facilities have not been operational since, I believe, about 2007. And so there are many opportunities for dam removal. And where those opportunities don't exist, we have funding to invest in rehabilitation and retrofit. Excitingly, in 2024, California voters passed Proposition 4 for ecosystem restoration, particularly along the coast. Prop 4 represents a $10 billion investment for climate resilience work in California, including for dam removals. And so some of you might be familiar with some of the work American Rivers is doing. I presented on this to some of you yesterday. It's called our Active 150 process, and American Rivers has raised up for our community of practice in California opportunities throughout the state where that $10 billion for climate resilience work can be implemented to remove some of these obsolete and unsafe dams from our landscape to protect our communities, revitalize tribes, and help our fisheries recover. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was wonderful. And now we are going to pass it over to Erin Singer McCombs, our Southeast Conservation Director. Take it away, Erin. Oh, Erin, you're muted.
Okay, let's see. Let me share this again. Okay, how are we looking? Looking good. Have you ever heard one of your best friends squeal with joy through a snorkel because they saw a brightly colored fish in the river for the first time? So I'm going to start my presentation by telling you about me and the places that have informed me and how I find myself in my favorite habitat, which you can see on the screen, me in the Oconaluftee River. So I grew up on one of the hardest working rivers in America, the Mississippi River in Memphis, Tennessee. But that's not where I fell in love with rivers. I was kind of told, don't touch that water because, if you do, you will be sucked in and not make it. So we went on family vacations to the Spring River in Hardy, Arkansas. And so it was there that I would don my goggles. I've always been a swimmer, and I'd swim with the silvery shiners below a roaring drop in the river for as long as I could pretend not to hear my parents telling me that it was time to go. So then fast forward a number of years to my master's work at Appalachian State, where the world of freshwater mussels was revealed to me. That's a freshwater mussel you're seeing there. And I discovered how creative and cryptic they are and how they're better anglers than any that I know, and I bet that any that are on the call today. So I would put my mask on, now upgraded with a snorkel, and I would survey the streams in almost every county in Alabama, from the clear, swift streams to the slow, hot, and stinky ones I still regret getting in. And so it was in that work that I was baptized into a community of freshwater mussel folk, where I learned of the daily grief that goes along with this work. We're losing these filter feeders. And people who don't know much about mussels still benefit from cheaper, cleaner drinking water. And people who do know about mussels, like me, and now like you, know that we don't want to know what a world without mussels will be like. So I live in Asheville, North Carolina. So let's fast forward to September of last year when Helene hit. And these awe-inspiring rivers changed. We lost valued community members. We lost the green spaces that we relied on for recharge and connection. The rivers we went to for fun and recreation, the rivers that supported the local economy, were left clogged with trash and debris. And infrastructure, like dams and bridges and roads, failed across the region, leaving communities at risk. This is one example here. This is near the Nature Center along the Swannanoa River in Asheville. And you can see this is a dam here, and on that far side, the bridge on top of the dam and the dam washed downstream. And we don't exactly know what that wall of water looked like because the gauge was overtaken, but we saw dams across the region have this impact. So from this disaster, a strong partnership was further forged between a number of our partners. American Rivers, Riverlink, and Mountain True ensured that rivers were in the room when decisions are being made, as Lisa Raleigh with Riverlink likes to say. And so we listed the rivers of Southern Appalachia on America's Most Endangered Rivers list to call for the resources we need to recover and to adapt. So functionally, you can imagine we were meeting regularly, we were sharing information locally on the ground with decision makers in DC and in Raleigh, and we were sharing opportunities and really looking for silver linings together. So we focus our advocacy on the following areas. Obviously, you can imagine, based on the theme of today's call, that we were seeking to reducing the threat of damaged and unsafe dams. We also wanted to advocate for riverine storm debris cleanup, and later we learned that we also needed to advocate for it to be done in the right way. We wanted to make sure that folks could access federal disaster recovery funds. So I'm in Asheville. Many of you may have heard that, I was without drinking water for 54 days. And so we wanted to support the reconstruction of resilient water infrastructure. And finally, we recognize that rivers really need room to move, and so advocating for voluntary conservation buyouts as a part of this. So what I'm going to show you next focuses around the advocacy we were doing for resilience and river reconnection. So this is a short film really highlighting this part of the work to push for policy.
When we remove dangerous dams, we make communities safer. During Hurricane Helene, 41 high-hazard dams like the one behind me here failed or were severely damaged. And hundreds of outdated derelict dams need to be removed so that communities are safe when the next storm comes. These obsolete dams are not built to withstand the intensity of today's storms. But when removed, we can save lives and critical infrastructure. In 2021, the General Assembly in North Carolina invested $7.2 million that paid for the removal of 7 dams, including the Shoals Mill Dam removal near Boone, North Carolina, that protected critical road infrastructure.
With that dam in place during the flood, you would have seen a lot more potential for a catastrophic failure where the whole dam was pushed over by the flood and a flood wave goes downstream. And, you've got Highway 105 right here and a bridge downstream. Having that additional flood wave from a failing dam is something that could have been catastrophic.
And the Wards Mill Dam removal just downstream of Shoals saved lives.
We're right upstream from Wards Mill here on the Watauga River. On the day that the flood crested during Hurricane Helene, if that dam had still been there, the mill would have been gone, the house would have been gone, multiple houses upstream would have been inundated, and I don't believe that the dam would have been able to hold back the force of the water, and I think that we would have had some real problems downstream when the dam finally cut loose.
We can remove these dams before they fail. We now have an opportunity to leverage federal matching dollars so we can save lives, protect treasured habitat, create good jobs, and protect our communities.
So one thing to reiterate in that is that dam removal is resilience. And I'm not sure when we did Wards and Shoals removals that we really held that at the forefront. You don't know the disaster that is about to come, but that certainly was a good feeling when we realized that, the benefits that came out of these projects. So dam removal is resilience. So with Mountain True and Pew Charitable Trust, we got a win with the North Carolina General Assembly with House Bill 1012. $10 million was allocated to address unsafe high-hazard dams, and a new grant fund was established in North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, the North Carolina Dam Safety Grant Fund, which will play a role as infrastructure continues to be impacted by extreme weather. So a little backstory, we've been working with this group for a while to explore ways to support dam removal, and Helene really galvanized our efforts and direction. We have more dam removals on our plate now than ever before. Many dam owners after Helene decided that dam removal was their best option. Lowering flood elevations, ensuring communities are more resilient, supporting tourism and ecotourism, supporting public safety. These are all benefits that are really resonating with the community. Also, a little shout out to Mountain True for, as a part of this Most Endangered Rivers campaign, secured $10 million to create a storm debris cleanup program to create meaningful jobs and recover our rivers for people and nature. This is a great program. They've got, I think they'll hire ultimately about 90 people that will go out to different portions of the area and clean up a lot of these rivers. So it's a great program. And of course, as a part of all of this work, we had to have a little fun as well. So with New Belgium Brewing, we celebrated this Most Endangered Rivers partnership with a Life Depends on River event. So we celebrated the resilience of our community and asked people to join us to take action. We even have, as you can see on the right of the slide, we even had a live river painting that was auctioned at the event. I'll also mention that we celebrated Representative Chuck Edwards with our River Champions Award. And he has been really working hard on a lot of the reforms and has done a lot of work on dam safety as well. So this is a photograph I took down in the River Arts District in Asheville. And so you can see this is in front of, if folks are familiar with the area, it's in front of the Riverview Mill, where there's a lot of artists' studios or were. And it's a pile of rubble with a sculpture and a sign that says hope, even when the creek rises. And it was really meaningful to me. And we have a lot more work that needs to be done. We're still advocating for resources to address the unsafe dams that are still unaddressed. And that's something that is unsettling because we know that the next storm will come. And so we have all these high hazard dams in poor condition. We're also calling for better storm debris management, and we're engaging with the Federal Emergency Management Agency through reforms that are underway now. So I do want to leave you with a couple of lessons that we learned, just since I have this great platform at the moment. So we wanted the storm debris out of the rivers, the houses, the cars, the siding, all of that kind of thing. And the work that the Army Corps of Engineers did in the area was really important and needed. And in some cases, it went a little bit too far. And freshwater mussel populations were decimated, live trees were being cut, big trees that had been there before the storm were being removed. And we were really concerned, we are concerned about what that means for the stability of our rivers that we so depend on. So a couple of things that we've learned: it's important to pay contractors by the linear foot instead of by the ton, because they can go through, say what needs to be removed and move on, instead of being incentivized to pull absolutely everything out of the river. Contractors need to coordinate with biologists to protect sensitive areas for species. And we'd like to see enforceable standards instead of guidelines to really help protect our rivers when this work is happening. And I'll ask you a question. Is your river or community at a major decision point? So right now, America's Most Endangered Rivers nominations are open. You can scan this massive QR code if this is something that you might be interested in. I'll invite you to talk to any American River staff if you have some ideas, or feel free just to nominate a river. Putting this listing for the rivers of Southern Appalachia was a really helpful part of our effort to adapt from this really big disaster. So it was a helpful tool for us. And with that, I will thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to all of our speakers. This was an incredible amount of information and work that you all are doing across the country for our rivers. So thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your work with everybody here. We're going to open up to Q&A. So if you have questions for our presenters, please go ahead and navigate over to the chat and enter your questions. We don't have any right now, so I actually wrote one down. Dr. Null, can I ping you first?
Sure, I'm sorry, and what am I?
Oh, I'm going to ask you a question. You're good.
Okay.
What was one of the most surprising things that you found in your research?
I was surprised, and I'd mentioned this, I was surprised by the number of studies that focused on human health. And it's funny because I've talked to dam removal practitioners, and they were not surprised by that at all. But I think because so much of the literature about dam impacts focuses on environmental decision making and maybe underemphasizes the economics and the community support and the safety aspect. So that was the part that I was the most surprised about.
Excellent, thanks. I've got a question for Erin and Megan. I think you both work with your respective dam safety offices quite a bit, and might have broached the idea of dam removal as a climate resiliency tool. And a lot of dam safety engineers, we all work with them, right? They're very focused on keeping the structure safe. So how have they responded to this idea that, actually removing it could be a tool to protect communities instead of leaving it in place and continuing to shore up the structure.
Well, in our conversations with North Carolina Dam Safety, as they figure out how to roll out this new North Carolina Dam Safety Fund, one thing that we definitely agree on is that the safest dam is one that's no longer on the inventory because it has been removed. And so we anticipate that dam removals will score highest because of all of those benefits. And I think that that's an interesting thing with dam removal, is that you have so many benefits, like safety, like all the things that we talk about. And so it's really nice when particularly the economics and the ecology and safety all come together. So I do think that that's a real part of this resonating with a lot of people.
Excellent, thanks.
In California, the funding program that is used for dam safety is currently focused on retrofits, rehabilitation, and repairs. And that program was legislatively confined to those three categories when it comes to dam safety. And so American Rivers has written, I think now, 3 letters to the legislature asking them to reconsider their position. And we've also worked with groups over the last 2 years to try to revise that dam safety funding legislation so that it explicitly could include removal. But I think there's some education that needs to happen within the state of California, particularly around the cost of removal as opposed to the cost of repair and rehabilitation, because that's really the concern that's raised over and over again, is the expense of dam safety as a rationale to continue to omit it from that authorizing legislation for how the funding is deployed. And so here at American Rivers, we're working on some educational materials right now, and we're hoping to get that out in late 2025 and early 2026, coupled with additional efforts before the legislature to again revise the dam safety funding authorizing legislation. So we're working on it, but it's moving a little bit slower than hoped for.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. Sarah, Dr. Null, we have a question in the chat for you. For the lit review, climate resilience seems like they were defined as they have been for quite a while, going back to Pet's 84 book. Did you come across anything new or surprising from a climate resilience standpoint? Greenhouse gas from decomposing biological matter comes to mind.
Yeah, great question. So we defined climate resilience as the ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from adverse events related to climate change. So yeah, pretty standard definition, one used by NOAA. And we did come across some, I would say, some of these like newer climate resilience factors, like greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs specifically came up in a number of studies. I want to say it was less than 5, but it was a topic that we noticed coming up. So particularly for things like hydropower dams, where for the longest time people said hydropower dams are carbon neutral, and increasingly that's been shown to be not the case, that reservoirs release a good amount of carbon. And so yeah, we saw the greenhouse gas emissions specifically come up in some of the studies.
Thank you. We've got another question we're going to go ping around. Megan, anything in your work that's going on to help us with prioritization as we work on some of those old and full debris dams that we haven't already discussed and or could be useful for the broader audience?
Sure. So in terms of prioritization, there was a tool I mentioned in passing. It's called the California Active 150. The foundation of it was actually Erin's work in North Carolina. So thanks so much, Erin, for really blazing that trail. We adapted this prioritization kind of process to the California environment. And in order to do that, we worked with an organization, the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, received funding from Fish and Wildlife Service to inventory all those small barrier dams across the entire country. So we worked with SARP to make sure there was a full inventory of California dams. That's where that 5,500 number came from. And then from there, we reached out to the groups in California that we know are the most engaged in dam removal. And that included federal agencies that are active in California. I think some of the folks I interviewed are on our call today. It included a lot of different folks that are at state level agencies, working with members of the California Fish Passage Forum, and we collected information regarding how those groups identify the dams that they are prioritizing removal of. And what we saw was that the priorities for all groups in California that are engaged in dam removal really kind of fit into the buckets of the quality of the habitat that's being reconnected, the climate resilience of that habitat, benefits to species and revitalization of species richness in our rivers, and the ease with which those dams can be removed or are ripe for removal. And so that is the information that formed the basis of our prioritization. And from that, we highlighted and raised up for our community 150 dams that are either undergoing dam removal planning and require major investments from funders, or are ripe for removal because there's agreement from the landowner and there's relatively minor conflicts with the uses of those reservoirs or the uses of the dams themselves. In other words, they can be retrofit with more modern infrastructure, such as a solar-powered pump diversion, as opposed to a dam that impacts the river more heavily. And so we are currently in the process of migrating all of that information into a dashboard function that would be public facing and that folks can use to isolate dams that might be a priority for them to remove. For instance, if you are at a resource conservation district, you can sort by county so that you're looking only at the priority dams in your county. If you're laser focused on anadromous fish, as many groups are, you can look at just the species richness data and just prioritize from those dams that would benefit anadromous fish. So there'll be a variety of ways to sort the data. You can look at the full prioritization, but all in all, we really expect this to increase the pace and scale of dam removal in California.
Thank you. Aaron, I've got 2 questions for you. So I'm gonna give them both to you. One, is there any talk about installing flood control dams in North Carolina post-hurricane flooding?
Yeah, so you can imagine that it takes a while to work through a process involving infrastructure. And so one of the things that we're really pushing for is that when folks are doing alternatives analysis to figure out how to address damage that happened in a certain area, that they're considering resilience. They're considering how do we, a popular phrase that we hear a lot is build back better. How are we not just replacing what was there before? And how are we looking to have, for instance, incorporate floodplain reconnection that includes flood storage instead of, just building some larger dam that could have increased risks. We learned from Megan, the design life issue and that how expensive things overall are on the long term. And so how can we add resilience and multiple benefits to the area? So we're hopeful that that really gets meaningful attention as these long range planning projects are happening for issues in the area.
Excellent. Well, thinking about long-term planning, is American Rivers planning to create and share a document outlining improved standards or recommendations for storm debris removal or partners potentially?
Yeah. So, I hear people talking about, we had the immediate response to the disaster, and now we're starting to get into kind of like the adaptation phase. What are we learning? How are we going to package those things up so they could maybe be put in policy, share with other folks that are working on that? And so that is something that us and our partners are very interested in. What are we learning? Just that one slide is just kind of the first pass of what we've been learning related to storm debris, but I do think that there is a lot of interest in different little working groups that are talking about that. So I absolutely would love to see that come out so that, that can be applied to other places. So great question, Amy. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, we've got one in the chat. Let's see here. Oh, it also went into there we go. We had one about PG&E submitting their surrender application for operating the dams on the Eel River, and FERC has yet to open a comment period or respond to the application. How long does FERC take to act or allow comment on surrender applications of dam removal? Megan, you want to tell them?
I don't even know how to answer this question.
I think the fact that we're laughing is the answer.
Yeah, we've seen a wide range of FERC timelines in the context of dam removals. You know, you have the Klamath River dams, which famously took 25 years to remove. You have projects like the DeSabla Centerville project on Butte Creek that's in year 17 of its relicensing. You have the Oroville Dam, which is in year 22 of its relicensing. Yeah, I mean, the timelines are wide, and unfortunately, when it comes to surrenders, there's no regulatory process in place that forces a response from FERC within a certain period of time. And so 2 months is honestly not the longest timelines that we've seen. We know that that is a relatively well-received dam removal by many communities, but it is not without its challenges. I believe I saw on the news and heard more from our colleagues at other conservation organizations over the past few weeks that the administration has entered the fray and may oppose the dam removal. And so I imagine, this is conjecture, but I imagine that that might be some of the holdup with FERC, given that the community and the dam owner and the entities that want to take over the diversion long-term have really been working in collaboration, particularly with tribes, to make sure that there's a positive outcome on the Eel River. And so I think we're just going to have to wait and see on this one because of the lack of certainty that the FERC regulations provide for the license, surrender, and removal process, unfortunately. But American Rivers does try to work on that with every Congress and make sure that there are timelines in place so that the process that applies to license, surrender, and dam removal can migrate towards the integrated license process, which does have those timelines that are enforceable against FERC. So fingers crossed that we can make it happen maybe in 2026.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we are at time, and I just want to give another huge thank you to our speakers today, and thank you to all our attendees who came for this important information. For the questions that didn't get answered, I will go ahead and follow up with our speakers, and I will try to get answers from them afterwards. This session will be recorded, and I will have the recording up on our National Dam Removal Community of Practice webpage. You can see our 14 other webinars that we have done in the last 2 years there as well. And if you have thoughts on what you'd like to see next in a webinar, please reach out to us. We'd like to hear your ideas. All right. With that, thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.